started coming about from the White House saying that birds were in the process of being on a mass level.
I should like to tell you that I have seen some of the experiments shown in this film.
We'll start with the mildly disturbing entries and slowly work our way to some of the most visually horrifying results on the web. I made this iceberg myself, and it's exclusively made up of the worst of the worst. Let's start at the tip of the iceberg. Level 1. Birds aren't real conspiracy theory. In 2019, a massive billboard popped up in Memphis, Tennessee declaring birds aren't real. Supporters of the movement insist that sometime between 1959 and 1971, the federal government exterminated all birds in the United States and replaced them with look-alike drones used to spy on citizens. The birds sit on power lines to recharge themselves and defecate on cars to track them. They also believe that John F. Kennedy didn't agree to kill all the birds and was assassinated to get him out of the way. The founder of the movement was 23-year-old Peter McIndoe in 2017. By 2019, several Birds Are Real accounts were popping up on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, with hundreds of thousands of followers. Supporters showed up at sports games chanting about birds. There were also stickers saying birds aren't real, appearing everywhere. Organized protest marches broke out. One of them was outside Twitter's headquarters in San Francisco to demand that the company change its former bird logo. McIndoe also did TV interviews on the movement. This went on for 7 years. Then, during an interview, McIndoe revealed that Birds Aren't Real was all made up, a satirical movement made up for laughs.
I have been playing a character for the past 5 years who believes that every bird is a surveillance drone and who's part of a larger movement called the Birds Aren't Real movement. I've been basically representing the movement, never leaving character.
Dark web. The dark web consists of websites that are not indexed by search engines. From the rumored Red Room to sites where people put out ads for cannibalism like Alexander Nathan Barter, the dark web makes it easy for criminals to thrive without the fear of law enforcement tracking them down. And it's all thanks to the onion router Tor, a specialized server that disguises IP addresses and, by extension, identities. Tor was developed by the US government in 2002 so members of the US intelligence community could use the internet without getting ID'd. But if the only people using the dark web were US spies, then it would have defeated the purpose. That's when they came up with the bright idea to release it to the general public in 2014. It worked. There weren't just American spies on the dark web anymore. Computer enthusiasts, privacy advocates, journalists, and people under repressive governments flooded to the site. But that kind of anonymity also attracted criminals. Everything from weapons and drugs, terrorists, hackers, hitmen, fake IDs, escorts, human trafficking, and the elusive Red Room. Then, there are those who use it for even more evil things. In October 2018, Alexander Nathan Barter was in Texas with a knife, trash bag, cellular phone, and a tablet. He was going to kill and eat the 13-year-old daughter of a man he had met on the dark web after Barter put out an ad on a dark website looking for someone to allow him to try necrophilia and cannibalism. But his plan hit a speed bump when he realized he had been talking to an undercover agent. He was arrested and sentenced to 40 years behind bars. Level 2. Salted frog legs. Salted frog's legs, also known as frog legs dance, is a bizarre phenomenon that people notice with frogs' legs. After a frog has been freshly killed and sprinkled with salt, they start to twitch like they're alive and dancing. But don't worry, those frog legs aren't haunted. It's all down to the sodium in the salt. They act like electric charges, firing nerves and triggering any energy left in the frog legs, causing the muscles to contract in what looks like hopping. The same thing was seen when frogs' legs were popped into hot soup or boiling water. The heat stimulated the muscles in the frog's leg to contract for a short period of time. A very weird and creepy spectacle. How to seduce a turkey. From the 1950s, farmers of commercial hatcheries and poultry scientists noticed a reduced number of hatched eggs among captive turkeys. For a long time, no one was sure what caused this. Then, Dr. Martin Sheen and Dr. Edward Hale took up the mantle and performed several experiments to understand the mind of the male turkey. While many of them were pretty ordinary, like inducing male and female turkeys into early mating phases, one experiment stood out from the others. Sheen and Hale wanted to figure out what part of the female turkey brings all the boys to the yard, and began making a taxidermy of a female turkey and a pen of attractive males, to find out what part of the female turkey turns them on. So they slowly removed parts of the turkey model, the feet, the wings, on and on. The turkeys never stopped trying to have sex with her. Soon, the body was gone and all that was left was a stick-mounted head and neck. Even when this caricature of a popsicle was presented to the male turkeys, they were still going wild trying to mate. The result of the experiment? Male turkeys would pretty much have with anything. Eyeball tattoo. Not many tattoos are so dangerous that they've been banned in 3 American states and 2 Canadian provinces, but eyeball tattoos made the very exclusive cut. Described as one of the most extreme forms of body modification, eyeball tattoos aren't exactly tattoos. They change the color of the eye permanently. Water-based tattoo ink is injected into the white of the eye at several points, and then the ink spreads around the eye. Apart from being very, very painful, this procedure has many risks, but that hasn't stopped people from trying this risky tattoo. One of them was Canadian model Kat Gallinger. In 2017, Gallinger went to a tattoo artist for a purple eyeball tattoo. However, the artist used too thick of ink and did not create enough injection sites. Her eyes started leaking purple liquid. The infection later spread and Gallinger's eyes got swollen. The botched procedure left her with blurry vision in one eye. That's not to say everyone who gets them goes blind. There are hundreds of success stories online. Farrah Flawless has had her eyes tattooed since 2007, and she's perfectly fine. So the question is, will you be getting your eye tattooed? Level 3. Tongue-eating louse. Nature is filled with many sweet moments. The sun's setting, a baby giraffe tries to stand for the first time. But there's nothing beautiful about the tongue-eating louse. As the name implies, the tongue-eating louse is a parasite that makes its way in the world by feeding on other animals' tongues. It looks horrifying, right? They sneak into fish through the gills, clamping on the fish's tongue, cutting off blood supply. When the tongue withers and falls off, the louse takes its place. But interestingly, the louse doesn't kill the fish. While it feasts off of some of the fish's blood and mucus, it also serves as the fish's new tongue. So the two continue to live side by side, and have even made it to seafood markets and restaurants. What happens if the tongue-eating louse ends up in humans? Lucky for you, this weird parasite hasn't got a taste for the human tongue yet, and some people even eat the louse as a part of a regular diet. So, eat up. Teratoma tumor. When cells in the human body age or become damaged, they die and new cells take their place. But sometimes this process doesn't go exactly that way, and abnormal cells grow and multiply when they shouldn't, forming lumps of tissue that could be cancerous or non-cancerous called tumors. But there's a rare type of tumor that happens to contain a little extra surprise: fragments of body parts like teeth, hair, bone, and muscle. These are called teratoma tumors and often occur in adults. Sometimes these gross tumors could even contain icky eyeballs. So how does this stuff of nightmares come to be? Well, these tumors come from cells that would have become organs like the eyes and the body, but something stops them from developing. So they remain dormant for decades before eventually developing somewhere in the body. Those that were to become hair have strands of hair, those meant to be eyeballs have eyes. In case you're worried you might have an eyeball lurking in your body, this tumor only occurs in about 1 in 14 out of every 100,000 people each year. That doesn't mean you can't be one of those 14, though. Brian Peppers. In 2005, a picture of Brian Pepper started circulating on ytmnd.com, a popular internet website for memes. The picture was so bizarre that it quickly became a popular meme. Many people thought Brian's face was faked or photoshopped. It was only later that it got out that this was the picture of a real person. Brian was born with a disorder called Crouzon syndrome. This condition caused him to have protruding eyes and deformed facial features. Eventually, it crippled him, and he was later taken to a nursing home. But very few people felt sorry for ridiculing Brian. The reason his picture had made it online was because he was on the sex offender registry in Ohio after being convicted for gross sexual imposition in Ohio in 1998. One version of the story says that Brian had groped a nurse taking care of him. However, the sex offender registry states that it was a female. Brian served 30 days in jail and a further 5 years probation for this crime. The meme became popular again in 2012 after Brian Peppers passed away from complications with excessive drinking. Disgusting things in fast food. Fast food is high in calories, fat, sugar, and salt, but low in nutrients. Just 2 reasons why health experts are against it. But the things these people found in their food might be why you'll think twice before getting a Big Mac. Ron Murray certainly will. The Canadian man ordered coffee from a McDonald's. After drinking it all day, he opened it to take that last sip. But inside the cup, he found a nasty surprise, a dead mouse.
So I always take the lid off to take my last gulp of coffee. And when I took the lid off, there was a little bit of surprise in my coffee cup. It was a dead mouse.
Then there was the Cadbury debacle in 2003, after several cases of the dairy milk chocolate was reported to have worms in them. But the craziest might have been John Agnesini, who got a Subway sandwich in New York in 2008. After he bit into something hard, he opened his sandwich to find a 6-inch knife in the middle. This little error cost Subway $20,000. And before you think disgusting things are strictly in fast food, there's the story of a German tourist named Axel Sanz-Klaus who ordered a $40 filet mignon at the Bull and Bear restaurant in New York. In his first bite, he bit right into a bloody tampon. That's one way to get your daily dose of iron. On second thought, maybe homemade food is safer. Hyperdontia. The typical child has 20 teeth in their mouth. By the time they reach adulthood, those baby teeth would have been replaced with 32 shiny teeth. But that's not always the case. A condition called hyperdontia can cause people to have more teeth. It could be just one, or it could be a lot more. These extra teeth grow very close to regular teeth, crowding the mouth, and can be removed. One 17-year-old in India had 232 teeth in his mouth and had to have them all extracted during a 7-hour operation. But as bizarre as it looks, hyperdontia isn't dangerous or life-threatening. It just swells and pains the jaw and gums. No one knows exactly what causes it. Genetics may play a big part in who gets it and who doesn't. Level 4. Patricia Piccinini. Patricia Piccinini is a Sierra Leone-born artist known for creating hyper-realistic, genetically modified beings using silicone, human hair, and wood. In 2016, when the TAC, Transport Accident Commission in Victoria, Australia, noticed a rise in car accidents, they decided to do something different to create a conversation around road safety. The TAC commissioned renowned Sierra Leone-born artist Patricia Piccinini, trauma surgeon Christian Kenfield, and crash investigation expert David Logan. This unusual trio was brought together to design an evolved human that could survive any car crash. The result was Graham, something or someone that would become several people's worst nightmares. From a flat face chock full of fat to a dozen nipples and a huge skull, every part of Graham was carefully thought out to cushion the impact of the knocks and jolts from an accident. But Project Graham was not the first time Piccinini dabbled in creating hyper-realistic genetically modified beasties using human hair, silicone, leather, and wood. She has quite the history of making these grotesque works of art. Nutty Putty Cave Tragedy. The Nutty Putty Cave was once a popular attraction for professional and amateur cavers alike, including Boy Scout troops and college students. Located in Utah, United States, the cave's tight twists, turns, and crawls, as well as its narrow and slippery passageways, attracted almost 5,000 a year. Some of them came at night, and 4 times, people had gotten stuck inside and had to be rescued. It was just a matter of time before tragedy struck. Authorities closed the cave in 2006, but cave supporters protested the closure, and Utah officials reopened the cave in March 2009. On November 24, 2009, 26-year-old John Edward Jones decided to go caving at Nutty Putty. He was married with a kid and another on the way. While he had plenty of experience caving with his father and brother as a kid, Jones hadn't done a lot of caving as an adult. Nevertheless, he showed up at Nutty Putty with his brother and 9 other friends at 8 p.m. After an hour of exploring the larger caves, Jones broke apart from the group to take on a challenge, the very narrow passageway called the Birth Canal. Jones went face first into some tight passages until he got wedged face first into a dead end and couldn't back out. There was nowhere to go, and he couldn't back out. All anyone could see were his 2 feet. Over the next couple of hours, 137 rescuers showed up and desperately tried to save him. They even set up a sophisticated rope and pulley system to pull him out. But John's 6-foot and 200-pound frame was just too much. The pulley later snapped, and Jones slid back into the crevice and was now unresponsive. Being in an inverted position for 27 hours finally caught up with Jones, and he died of cardiac arrest. It was too dangerous to get his body out of the cave, so explosives were used to collapse the cave close to Jones' body, burying him forever. Level 5. Electrocution of an elephant. On January 4th, 1903, 1,500 spectators gathered at the newly opened Luna Park in Coney Island. Among them, there was a cameraman. All eyes were on the 10-foot-tall, 6-ton elephant, Topsy. Topsy had been smuggled into the U.S. from Southeast Asia in the late 1800s to work at a circus. Over the next 2 decades, she got a reputation as a bad elephant after she killed 3 of her handlers, including one who had tried to feed her a lit cigarette. By this time, Topsy had been sold to Coney Island's Sea Lion Park, which Frederick Thompson and Elmer Dundee would later own. They closed the park for renovation. In 1902, when it was time to open its doors, the publicity-hungry owners decided to create a spectacle by killing their troublesome elephant in a public hanging and selling tickets for people to watch. But the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals threw a wrench in their plans. They had to kill her humanely, so they decided to electrocute Topsy. As a precaution, she would also be poisoned. On January 4th, 1903, with a cameraman recording, the 6-ton elephant was brought out. She had already been fed cyanide-laced carrots. Copper plates were fastened to her feet, and 6,600 volts were shot through her body. She died almost instantly. The 74-second film was titled Electrocuting an Elephant and released later that year. Over a century has passed since then, and the finger now points to Thomas Edison as the mastermind behind Topsy's death. But While Edison was behind the electrocution of several cats, dogs, cattle, and even a horse, he was never at Luna Park and stopped electrocuting animals a decade earlier. Dog head transplant. The 1940s and 1950s were crazy times for science and experiments. Things that could only be considered science fiction in this day and age, like dog head transplants and reanimating the heads of dead dogs. One of these bizarre experiments was performed by a Soviet scientist named Sergei Brunkanenko and released in a 1940 documentary called Experiments in the Revival of Organisms. The video shows a decapitated dog's head connected to a heart-lung machine, reacting to objects and licking its nose. Inspired by Brunkanenko's work, another Soviet scientist, Vladimir Demikov, took these experiments further. In 1954, he surgically created two-headed dogs by attaching the head, neck, and front legs of a puppy to the side of an adult dog, and the dogs survived. The decapitated head would even take a few mouthfuls of water from a bowl, even though it had no stomach. Demikov performed these experiments on at least 20 dogs, but the longest they ever lived was 29 days. Demikov already had an impressive track record of world firsts in the surgical community, but the dog head transplants were just a step too far, and even though they paved the way for future transplant experiments, the medical community ignored them. The Cameraman's Revenge. The Cameraman's Revenge was a 12-minute silent Russian film created by Ladislav Tsarevich in 1912. Unlike many celebrities, the actors in this movie could be found in just about every garden, and they had no paparazzi chasing after them. They were bugs, dead bugs that were stop animated like puppets. The film began with a popular human sentiment. Mr. Beetle, bored with married life, went to meet up with his lover, a dragonfly, at a nightclub where she performed. But the dragonfly had a jealous ex, a grasshopper, and Beetle and Grasshopper got into a fight before Mr. Beetle and the dragonfly left together to make love. Mr. Beetle didn't realize that the grasshopper was a cameraman and he was filming them getting down and dirty. When Mr. Beetle returned home, he found a nasty surprise. Mrs. Beetle had a lover too, a young artist beetle. After beating up the lover, Mr. Beetle forgave his wife and took her out to see a new movie. He had no idea that Grasshopper worked the projector, and he screened Mr. Beetle's affair with the dragonfly. After Mrs. Beetle attacked Mr. Beetle and the grasshopper, she and her husband ended up behind bars. Even though the entire cast is made of dead insects, getting their limbs moved around, a century later, this bizarre movie continues to delight many. Why the chainsaw was invented. The chainsaw, a handy engine-powered saw for cutting trees, ice, and all things outdoorsy. But the chainsaw was not invented for anything remotely close to this. Today, when babies get stuck during delivery, a cesarean section is the easiest way to get the baby out. But back in the good old days, which weren't all that good, women were still dropping like flies because doctors didn't even know enough to wash their hands before digging their hands into a woman's hoo-ha. So, in the 1770s, when French doctor Jean-René Segal came up with the idea to cut open the pelvic joint and widen the women to get the baby out, the idea spread like wildfire, even though it was slow, painful, and caused infections. A decade later, two Scottish doctors, John Aitken and James Jeffrey, built on his idea and made sharper saws. This would later be developed into the hand-cranked chainsaw by German physician Bernhard Heine. These procedures were done without anesthesia, and mothers were conscious throughout. By 1905, the chainsaw was unceremoniously kicked to the curb and was quickly adopted by the timber industry. However, it was still used on about 1,500 women in Ireland between 1944 and 1987 without their knowledge or consent. Several of them developed arthritis in their hips and spines and walked with limps, while others relied on painkillers for the rest of their lives. Level 6. Delphine de Lalaurie. The house on 1140 Royal Street in New Orleans, USA, has had a wild history. It's been a public high school, a conservatory of music, and a furniture store. At one point, actor Nicolas Cage even bought it. But the three-story mansion once had a dark history that came to light on April 10, 1834, when a fire broke out in the kitchen. At that time, it was the home of wealthy society matron Madame Delphine Lalaurie. Lalaurie was known for being generally polite to black people and attentive to her slaves' health. She even freed 2 of her slaves after the slave trade was banned. Yet, there were rumors behind closed doors that Lalaurie mistreated her slaves, keeping her cook chained to the kitchen stove and chasing slaves around with whips. But the reality turned out to be much worse. That fateful day, rescuers responding to the fire attempted to enter the slave quarters and ensure that everyone had been evacuated, but Lalaurie refused to give them the keys. When they broke the door, they found out why. Not only were slaves still in the building, they were tied up and emaciated. Some of them were suspended by the neck, flayed by whips, and had spiked iron collars around their necks. When they dug the yard, they would find the bodies of several slaves, including a 12-year-old girl who had fallen to her death while running from Lalaurie's whip. The tortured slaves were taken to a local jail where they were available for public viewing. Up to 4,000 people trooped in for this circus. As the news spread, an angry mob attacked her residence and destroyed everything. Lalaurie fled to the city of Paris with her mother and sisters in the confusion. In 1942, a copper plate was found in a cemetery with her name on it. But the folklore around Lalaurie lives on. Some say she killed as many as 600 slaves. Others say she was driven to madness because her husband was sleeping with the slaves. One particularly gruesome tale goes that Delphine killed slaves to create a beauty balm from a fresh human pancreas. The mansion still stands today, and guests claim to have seen ghosts dragging chains. The Anthill Kids. From the People's Temple, founded and ended by Jim Jones, to Heaven's Gate by Marshall Applewhite, history is filled with stories about spiritual groups and cults that have gone horribly wrong. And one of them was the Anthill Kids. On August 16, 1988, Gabrielle Lavallee showed up in a hospital in Toronto in a horrible state. Several of her teeth were missing, and she was missing an arm. Her attacker was a man called Roch Thériault, the cult leader of the Anthill Kids. This was not his first brush with the law. In 1981, Roch had been sentenced to 2 years in prison and 3 years probation after the charred remains of a 2-year-old Samuel Gilguer were found in the commune. The boy had been having difficulty urinating, and Roch decided to treat him by slicing open his. When the boy died, Roch had ordered them to burn his body. But Roch didn't start like this. In the beginning, Roch preached that the corrupt world would end in an apocalypse in February 1979, and the only ones who would escape were he and his followers. 16 people, including 4 children, followed him, abandoning their homes and families and dropping out of college. They followed Roch to build the commune, but Roch didn't do any work. As he watched his followers scramble like ants to do his bidding, Roch was inspired to call them the Anthill Kids. To increase his followers, Roch married all the women in the commune and impregnated them, fathering 26 children. Things worsened when February 1979 came and went without Roch's prophecy happening. Gradually, Roch became more unhinged. He forced a man to cut his wife's toe because she wanted to leave, made them eat their own and others' feces, and forced commune members to break their legs with sledgehammers. Roch became convinced that people were sick even if they weren't. He would treat them, doing things like wine enemas. One of the most gruesome assaults happened to a woman called Gabrielle Lavallee. When they weren't shoplifting, cult members raised money by making maple syrup, preserves, bread, and smoking fish and selling them door to door. When Gabrielle didn't earn enough, Roque punished her by forcibly removing her teeth with pliers. Another time, he amputated her arm without anesthesia, smashing her head with an axe and a couple of more things that are just too gruesome to go into. Gabriel snuck away and was able to get help. He was given a 10-year sentence, but several of his wives moved close to his prison to wait for his release. It never came. In 2011, 63-year-old Roque Thériault was stabbed and killed by an inmate, the final nail in the Anthill Kid's coffin. Noma. In Asia, the Americas, and especially Africa, a disease called Noma is ravaging impoverished communities. People who survive are left with some of the worst disfigurements to their faces. They are the lucky ones. Because Noma is more common in areas with poor medical care and exposure, what starts as a mouth ulcer quickly becomes much worse. When the disease starts disfiguring the face, they are often kept hidden indoors because many believe the disease is either contagious or caused by witchcraft. Even though it can be treated by improved hygiene, antibiotics, and better food, very few ever make it to a hospital. As a result, 90% of people who get Noma die. Few who survive are left with severe facial disfigurements and have difficulty speaking and eating. They are often stigmatized and hidden away. Just a few are lucky to get operations and lead an almost normal life. Run the Gauntlet Challenge. The Gauntlet Challenge, or Run the Gauntlet, was a challenge on an internet shock site called runthegauntlet.org. It was simple. Watch 20 increasingly disturbing videos online and make it to the last one. There were videos like a girl breaking an arm while arm wrestling, a guy getting paper cuts, and another playing Russian roulette with cups that had a knife under one. These were just 3 of the 20 videos. The rest could be anything from porn, torture, to graphic violence and animal torture. The challenge became popular in 2014, and several YouTubers made reaction videos online where they tried to run the gauntlet.
I can't do it.
It resurfaced in 2022 with new shock videos, and several TikTokers and YouTubers joined the challenge, with many claiming to have been traumatized. However, it's also worth noting that some clips aren't real and have been created to incite fear. So, will you be running the gauntlet? The Real Exorcism of Emily Rose. The Exorcism of Emily Rose was a 2005 American horror film about a lawyer who took on a negligent homicide case involving a priest who performed a deadly exorcism on a young woman called Emily Rose. The film was based on the very real, very tragic life of Anneliese Michel. Anna was born to a devout Catholic family in 1952 in West Germany. By the time she was 20, she had been diagnosed with psychosis and depression and was being treated in a psychiatric hospital and on heavy psychiatric medication. While on these meds, Anna would lick her urine off the floor, growling at crosses, and eat spiders. Once, she bit off the head of a dead bird. That's when her family stopped consulting doctors and decided that Anna had to be possessed. They approached the Roman Catholic Church for an exorcism in 1975, and once they got the approval from a bishop, Annaliese's life became a living nightmare. Over the next 10 months, 2 Roman Catholic priests conducted 67 exorcisms on Anna. There are disturbing and haunting audio recordings of some of these exorcisms.
Ich verbrech das so, dass ich in dem Wald rein bin. Ich trag dir die Rotznase noch so lang, bis es lebt wird. Die Saublöderei. Für uns geht's kein Zurück. Sie in alle Ewigkeit.
Each session lasted for up to 4 hours, and Anna was restrained and kept on her knees. The continual kneeling and prayer caused some of her bones to break and tendons to be ripped from her knees, but she was never taken for treatment and kept on her knees despite the injuries. Anna stopped eating, and on July 1st, 1976, she died of dehydration and malnutrition. She was 23 years old and weighed only 33 kilograms. Anna's parents and the 2 Roman Catholic priests were found guilty of negligent homicide and were sentenced to 6 months in jail. This was later reduced to 3 years of probation for the priests. Her parents never served time because they had suffered enough. David Kallick, 4chan. In November 2014, 3 grisly photos appeared on 4chan. It showed the naked body of 30-year-old Amber Lynn Schraw lying on a bed with strangulation marks around her neck. The mother of 5 was dead. The anonymous poster lamented that it was harder to strangle someone to death. He also went into detail about his plan to end his life. He also went on a rant about how he had done it. When police went to her home, they found her driver's license, which had the word "dead" scrawled over it. The killer was her live-in boyfriend, 33-year-old David Kallick, a man she had known since her teens. Despite his plan for suicide by a cop, David walked up to a police officer and confessed what he'd done. He had a confession note on him. David's defense was that he had drank half a gallon of vodka, 18 cans of beer, and blacked out. In the days after the photos surfaced, some people started using the photos of Copland's body and face to make off-putting memes. A Serbian film. In 2010, Serbian director Srđan Spasojevic released A Serbian Film, a movie that some would describe as the most disturbing of all time, made its debut in cinemas. It was about a struggling porn star called Milos, who got a gig to feature in an art house movie, but the director was making a snuff film. He drugged Milos and made him perform highly violent acts, including sexually and raping and decapitating a woman, getting sized, and just the most gruesome and bloody deaths. In the end, Milos himself, his wife, and his son. Then another film crew enters their room where their bodies are, and the director made a remark about the dead. The graphic movie had every heinous theme under the sun. Rape, incest, murder, child abuse, you name it. The film was released with mixed reviews in some countries. Others, including the Philippines, Spain, and Australia, banned it altogether. In the United Kingdom, the film only aired after 4 minutes and 11 seconds of its original content were removed, making it the second most censored movie in the UK. Byford Dolphin Incident. Diving deep in the ocean comes with risks like decompression sickness, so divers often stay in depressurizing chambers with beds, supplies, and other necessities they need while they work, saving time and keeping the divers under pressure the whole time. It was a win-win approach, until it wasn't. On November 5, 1983, 4 divers, Edwin Coward, Roy Lucas, Bjorn Bjørgensen, and Truls Hellevik, returned from a deep-sea commercial mission near the Byford Dolphin oil rig in the North Sea. They returned to the connected compressed living chambers they shared, and diving tenders William Crammond and Martin Saunders began balancing the pressure between the main living chambers and the diving bell room, a process they had done a dozen times. But this time, something happened. And the pressure in the chambers went from 9 atmosphere to 1. William and Michael were hit with the diving bell, killing William and seriously injuring Martin. Inside the chamber, 3 of the divers were boiled from the inside and exploded, scattering their bodies all over the chambers. The body of the 4th diver was sucked through a tiny opening and separated into pieces. He was sent to the autopsy in 4 separate bags. As gruesome as this sounds, they likely never felt a thing. The rig blamed the men, claiming they had likely made a mistake after working for 12 hours. It took their families 26 years to get a report that showed that failures of the equipment were what caused their deaths and got compensation. The Poughkeepsie Tapes. In 2001, police found 800 tapes in an abandoned house in Poughkeepsie, New York. The tapes showed decades of killings by brutal serial killer Edward Carver. Edward had made the films going into excruciating detail to record everything from his stalking to their gruesome murders, including the moment he sewed one man's head to his wife's torso, all in graphic detail. Edward was never caught. For a long time, many were terrified that Edward Scraver was still roaming the streets. There was just one problem with that. Edward Scraver was not real, and the Poughkeepsie tapes was not a documentary, but a movie filmed to look like a documentary. Even with that, many were still convinced that the murder scenes were so chillingly real that they had been taken from actual snuff tapes of real killers. They weren't too far from the reality. The scenes had been inspired by 3 serial killers. There was Kendall Francois from Poughkeepsie, New York, convicted of killing 8 women. Then Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. Ted Bundy, who tortured and killed at least 11 people, and Jeffrey Dahmer, who killed and photographed 17 men. All 3 combined to create the horrific Edward Carver in what is still ranked as one of the most infamous and creepiest found footage horror movies of all time. Vladimir Komarov's funeral image. The US-Russia space race was one of the most significant technological rivalries of the last century. While it brought many milestone victories, both countries suffered just as many failures and casualties. One of them was Vladimir Komarov, known as the man who fell to Earth. In October 1964, Vladimir commanded a spaceflight that was the first to carry more than one crew member to space. On October 23, 1967, he became the first Soviet cosmonaut to fly in space twice, when he was selected to pilot a capsule on another mission. But just after launch, problems began trickling in. A solar panel failed to unfold, limiting the electricity reserves, and there were problems maneuvering the craft. To make it worse, he had lost contact with ground control, and fuel was running low. The mission had clearly failed, so the only thing left to do was to try to get the ship down to Earth. It was a last resort nobody had planned for. But if anyone could pull it off, it would be Vladimir. He sounded pretty confident at first as he re-entered the atmosphere, but within seconds, disaster. The main parachute and secondary chute tangled up with each other. There are rumors that Vladimir cursed the people who put him on the ship just before the capsule crashed and exploded in flames. Shockingly, Vladimir knew the space capsule was not safe to fly. Technicians had found 203 problems with the capsule, but Vladimir wouldn't back out because he didn't want his backup and best friend Yuri Gagarin to take his place and die. Vladimir allegedly did the only thing he could. He demanded an open casket funeral so the Soviet officials would be forced to see the result of their mistakes. This 31-inch long irregular lump was all that was left of his body. Only a chipped heel bone survived the crash.